End of this video is define dissolving and then explain what actually happens to the particles in a solute when it dissolves in a solvent. Remember, I'm going to start using those words solute and solvent. So if you're not familiar with them, maybe go back and watch the other video again, or email me, Google Hangouts. Let's talk this through until you do understand it. Okay. All right. So dissolving. Let's start. Dissolving is not melting or disappearing. Please do not use those terms. If you give me that in a worksheet or an answer where you say that, I will not give you the mark. You aren't right. I don't want you to use those terms. They're not scientific. Or they are scientific. They describe something, but they don't describe dissolving. Okay? All right. Dissolving means that the particles of the solute break up into smaller particles and fit between the particles of the solvent. All right. So what that means is, let me reach over here. If this is our solvent, so we're just going to use water as the example for our solvent. And remember, that's the thing that does the dissolving. These are our particles. Okay, I'm just going to use two because I've only got one hand. Okay, and this is our salt. Okay, our salt is my first. When we drop it in, the salt breaks up inside the water, and then it actually becomes so small that it can fit between the particles of water, or between the particles of the solvent. So that's what happens. Dissolving is when the solute breaks into smaller particles. It breaks up into smaller pieces, and those particles can actually fit in between the particles of our solvent. And when that happens, they disappear. They mix together, and we can't tell them apart. Okay. When this happens, the solute is no longer visible. What happens is the solute breaks up into such small pieces that we can't see it. It actually breaks up and then fits between the spaces in the solvent, between those particles. Okay, so here's an example of that. Okay, over here we have the solvent, these big particles. Here we have a solute. All of them together, we can see them clearly. But what happens when we mix them together? The solute particles fit between the solvent particles, and the solvent particles are actually quite hard for us to see. The solvent particles are all we see, and these solute particles might change the color a little bit of our solution, but what's really happening is the solute particles are fitting between them. So when a solute dissolves, the particles break up into smaller particles. Those smaller particles fit between the particles of the solvent. When this takes place, the solute is no longer visible and is said to have dissolved. Okay, it's no longer visible. It hasn't disappeared. It's dissolved. It's still there. It's between the solvent particles. It is still there. We just can't see it. Okay. All right. That's dissolving. The next two terms I want to talk about are soluble and insoluble. And they're pretty easy to understand, and I think you'll get them pretty easily. But there's one little caveat, which means there's one little thing added to the end that I think you guys really do need to get straight. Okay, so the two terms are soluble and insoluble. Soluble is a word we use to say if a solute will dissolve in a solvent. So salt is soluble in water. It means that salt will dissolve in water. But what I want to say is we cannot say that salt is soluble by itself, because salt isn't soluble by itself. We need to say that salt is soluble in water. We need to say this solute can dissolve in this solvent. Salt can dissolve in water, but salt cannot dissolve in oil. So if you just say salt is soluble, that's not correct. It doesn't make sense. You have to say this solute, this thing, can dissolve in this solvent. So this is soluble in this solvent. Please, that's the thing you need to keep in mind. You can't just say it can dissolve. You have to say it can dissolve in what? Okay? And insoluble means that a solute cannot dissolve in a solvent. Okay? The salt, here's my example I just used. Salt is soluble in water. Salt is insoluble in milk. Okay? It can dissolve in water, but it can't dissolve in milk. Okay? And okay, so this is what I want you to know. Define dissolving, define soluble, define insoluble, and explain to me what happens to the particles in a mixture when they dissolve. The particles of a solute, what happens to them when they dissolve in a solvent. All right, thank you. Hope that makes sense. Email me if you have any questions.